My name is Roger Nicholson. I am Fair Mormon's Director of Web Content. So if you find anything wrong on any of Fair Mormon's websites, I might be to blame. If you find anything needs correcting, please let me know and we'll fix it. Most of my time over the past few years has been spent working on the wiki, what we call now the Fair Mormon Answers Wiki, which used to just be called the Fair Wiki. And this is a database that's pretty amazing. It's like Wikipedia on a smaller scale. It contains approximately 4,000 articles, each one of them responding to a specific critical claim or a specific question. And the wiki has evolved and developed. And being a wiki, it gets changed constantly. That's the nature of a wiki. We have editors go in and modify articles and improve them. And hopefully it just becomes better and better. It certainly has a significant impact in Google results. So I would encourage you to take a look at it and see what's in there and what's available. I'm going to introduce our next speakers, which are Matt Roper and Paul Fields. Matthew Roper is currently a research scholar at the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship at Brigham Young University. He received a BA in history and an MA in sociology from BYU and has published numerous articles and review essays on issues relating to Latter-day Saint history and scripture. Paul J. Fields' PhD is a consultant specializing in research methods and statistical analysis. He has worked with the Neal A. Maxwell Institute on stylometric and authorship attribution studies of the Book of Mormon and other documents relating to the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He received his doctorate from Pennsylvania State University, and during his academic career, he was on the faculty of the United States Naval Postgraduate School and Brigham Young University.
They said to speak straight down the microphone here, so good afternoon. Today we are going to discuss two things relating to the issue of style in the Book of Mormon. First, we're going to discuss the style of Book of Mormon writer or writers, and second, we will talk a little bit about scriptural style in the Book of Mormon. Now, these are the two that we'll be talking about. Latter-day Saints believe the Book of Mormon is exactly what it purports to be, a record containing the writings of multiple ancient prophetic authors. Few critics of the Book of Mormon have paid much attention to the distinctions between writers set forth in the text. But even for those who reject Joseph Smith's account of the Book of Mormon, the issue of single or multiple authorship has long been a question of some disagreement. In 1831, Alexander Campbell claimed the book professes to be written at intervals and by different persons during the long period of 1,020 years. And yet, for uniformity of style, there never was a book more evidently written by one set of fingers, nor more certainly conceived in one cranium than this same book. If I could swear to any man's voice, face, or person, assuming different names, I could swear that this book was written by one man. And as Joseph Smith is a very ignorant man, I cannot doubt for a single moment but that he is the sole author and proprietor of it. In Mormonism Unveiled, that granddaddy of all anti-Mormon books, E.D. Howe seemed confident that no one can be left in doubt in identifying the whole Book of Mormon with one individual author. And again, it was framed and written by the same individual hand. But when he goes on to claim that it was also the joint production of Solomon Spaulding and some other designing knave, namely Sidney Rigdon, one senses some degree of confusion and perplexity on the matter. Subsequent advocates of variations of the Spaulding-Rigdon theory have sometimes suggested the contributions of other associates of Joseph Smith, such as Parley P. Pratt, Oliver Cowdery, or someone else. But most contemporary critics tend to favor a single author theory to explain Book of Mormon origins. In several, coming from a different perspective as a Latter-day Saint scholar, John Tanner has noted that Jacob, the brother of Nephi, appears to have a particular style all his own, which contrasts sharply with that of other writers, but is consistent with the events of his life as described in the text of the Book of Mormon. Tanner observes, Jacob has a vivid, intimate vocabulary, either unique to him or disproportionately present. 2/3 of the uses of grieve and tender, or their derivatives, are attributable to Jacob. Likewise, he is the only Book of Mormon author to use delicate, contempt, lonesome, sobbings, dread, and daggers. He deploys the last term in a metaphor about spiritual anguish, daggers placed to pierce their souls and wound their delicate minds. Similarly, Jacob alone uses wound in reference to emotions and never uses it, as do many other authors, to describe the physical injury of a person. Jacob uses pierce, or its variants, 4 of 9 instances in the Book of Mormon, and he alone uses it in the spiritual sense. Such stylistic evidence suggests that Jacob lived close to his feelings and was gifted in expressing them. In another interesting study, Roger Keller examined the use of content words by Book of Mormon writers. He found that Mormon's usage appeared to be distinct from other Book of Mormon writers in several ways. These include Mormon's use of the word command to mean leadership, his use of the word earth to refer to the ground, and Mormon's almost exclusive use of directional language in connection with the land. As Keller notes, he is the geographer par excellence. In contrast to other writers in the Nephite record, Mormon, quote, has almost no emphasis in the theological area. Moroni speaks of the land as one of promise and inheritance, while his father focuses on the land as a geographic and often localized entity. Grant Hardy, in a book that's been mentioned already, Understanding the Book of Mormon, has observed that Mormon is also rather non-typological. Mormon never speaks of war figuratively or makes it a metaphor for Christian living. There is no mention of putting on the armor of God or spiritual warfare against temptation, in contrast to Latter-day Saint readings of the war chapters in Alma. Although Mormon occasionally quotes people who identify certain things or events as types, typological thinking is not a major factor in his own understanding of history. The only time he refers to types, he is describing the beliefs of others. They did look forward to the coming of Christ, considering it the law of Moses was a type of his coming. By contrast, Moroni does offer an explicitly typological interpretation in his own voice in Ether 13. These and other elements, according to some readers, seem to set him apart from other writers in the Nephite text. A separate approach is exemplified in the work of other scholars over the last few decades. You probably didn't know that these two scholars wrote on the Book of Mormon, but who have studied the use of non-contextual words in the Book of Mormon text. These studies indicate a diversity of style in the text which is consistent with the diversity of writers set forth in the text. Now, a couple of these just in review. Mosteller and Wallace were not Latter-day Saint scholars, but their research on what we would call word prints today basically set the stage for Latter-day Saint scholars to apply some of these methodologies to studying the Book of Mormon. Larson and Rencher, of course, had an early study, first published in 1979 and republished in 1982. Then you had the work of John Hilton in the 1990s, and more recently, Paul Fields, Bruce Scalia, myself, and quite a number of young scholars have been working on some additional material that's been published. I'm going to, rather than quote ahead, let me just summarize that each of these groups of scholars have found evidence for a multiplicity of authorship in the Book of Mormon. That is, that there were multiple writers within the Book of Mormon. And interestingly enough, the evidence has also suggested in each case that these writers that are separate writers in the Book of Mormon, at least some of them, are quite distinct from 19th century authors that have been proposed as possible counter explanation authors for the Book of Mormon. Now, Bob Reese mentioned Earl Wunderli today. And it's already mentioned, he challenges the claim that there were multiple writers in the Book of Mormon text and devotes an entire chapter of his book to the question. He argues if the Book of Mormon is what it purports to be, differences in the vocabularies of these purported writers should be detectable. He discusses the frequencies of words and phrases for Nephi, Jacob, Mormon, Moroni, and the resurrected Jesus in 3rd Nephi, and concludes that there is little, if any, difference among various writers of the Book of Mormon, and that just one person, Joseph Smith, wrote the entire text. The methods used for data comparison and reasoning present a fertile field of discussion for such an investigation, but Wunderli's methodologies lack statistical validity. He mostly describes only grammatical uses of words and provides raw word counts and summaries to make comparisons. Had he used more appropriate methods, he might have been surprised at what he had found. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Paul to discuss this for a few minutes, and I'll be back on another subject.
Let's take a look at some of the analysis, the internal evidence that Wunderli refers to. He picks out 6 words: power, faith, blood, destruction, suffer, and miracles, as being words that show no difference between the word pattern choices and frequencies of word usages between Moroni and Mormon as speakers within the Book of Mormon. For example, the word power is used about 30 times by Moroni and 29 times by Mormon, meaning not much difference. But the difficulty with this analysis is, this is the same as saying, well, there was 30 cases of a disease in Utah and 29 cases of that same disease in California. Therefore, the health status of those 2 states is the same. Well, the population of California is 10 times bigger than the population of Utah, so the comparison is an invalid one. If we standardize the use of words in the Book of Mormon for those 6 words, we find that a comparable basis of 100,000 word usage, that the frequency of the use of the word power by Moroni is much greater than by Mormon. And so their word pattern ratios, their word pattern frequencies show a distinct difference in preference for those 6 words. Wunderli also says that there's a broader set of 27 words that show no difference. However, when we use statistical tests on a comparable basis for those word frequencies, we find, for example, that for these 7 words where the blue bars are the highest, there's over 1 trillion times difference in the frequency of those words amongst the authors as stated. The strength of evidence for a difference between them is overwhelming. Using discriminant analysis, which in a 2-dimensional space will separate clusters of items, we find that using his 27 words, that Mormon forms one cloud of dots representing the texts that we can attribute to Mormon. Moroni is the blue dots, Nephi is the orange dots, and then Jacob is off to the far right in the green dots. Distinctly different word pattern usages. If we, however, use a more distinguishing set of words than those 27 that were chosen on a simplistic basis by Wunderli, the distinctions become even more clear. Wunderli takes a look at the quotations by Jesus the Christ in the New Testament and in the Book of Mormon, and he looks at the words that are used there and he says they are distinctly different from each other. However, again, when using statistical techniques to evaluate that claim, we find that there's only one word that is different, used differently by the Christ in the Book of Mormon than in the Bible, and that's the word behold. Interestingly, if we will take the three renditions of the prayer in Gethsemane by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and put them in parallel with each other, and look for similarities in the wording, we find in the green there are a few words that are used the same in the same place in all three renditions of the prayer. In blue, those are where the words are the same in twice, and then in yellow, where they're different. What we can conclude from this is, well, even in the New Testament, there must have been three Jesuses, not just one. Wunderli talks about vocabulary richness. Vocabulary richness refers to the breadth of a writer's vocabulary, how many words that writer uses, and claims that there's no difference between them. However, if we use the vocabulary richness statistic that is accepted in the stylometric field, that's referred to as K. We apply that to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We see some comparison differences there, where Mark has a more rich vocabulary than the others. If we look at Nephi, Jacob, Mormon, and Moroni, we see that Mormon and Moroni have very close to the same vocabulary richness. Interestingly, those four speakers have a more rich vocabulary in the Book of Mormon than within the Gospels in the New Testament. Now, since the King James Version of the Bible was a translation product of 54 learned men who spent 4 years doing their work, and the Book of Mormon was the translation product of one unschooled farm boy over about a 90-day period of time, we can say then that there's 250 times as much effort per word that went into the translation of the King James Bible as compared to the Book of Mormon. And if Joseph Smith alone could have accomplished that feat, he was indeed a remarkable man. So our conclusion is there's very strong evidence, in fact, that the major Book of Mormon authors are distinguishable, and the writing style in the Book of Mormon is at least on par with that in the King James Version of the Bible. An amazing feat even for a literary genius, but maybe not quite so amazing for a prophet of the Lord.
We're going to talk a little bit now about style, what we call the biblical style. Readers of the Book of Mormon have been aware that the influence on the Bible, on the text of the book from the beginning. The nature and significance of that influence, however, has often been a matter of dispute. No one questions the Book of Mormon appeared in a biblically saturated culture. This is a very interesting book, and it's actually pretty good. It's a recent one by Aaron Shalov, and he discusses the influence of the Bible on early American culture in the pre-Civil War period. There he discusses a genre of writing found in some political and historical texts called the Scriptural style or the ancient historical style. Shalov himself gives it the name Pseudo-Biblicism. This style adopted archaic language found in contemporary English Bibles, reminiscent of the biblical books of Chronicles or Judges, and included the use of words like thee, thy, thine instead of you or yours. Verbal endings such as eth, thereof were typical. Pseudo-Biblicism was popular from about 1750 to about 1850, after which it seems to have fallen out of use. Notable examples of books written in this style are the first Book of Napoleon by Eliakim the Scribe, a book that appeared in 1809, The History of the American Revolution by Richard Snowden in 1823, and The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain by Gilbert Hunt in 1816. Examples also appeared in some newspapers. Here is an example from one such article published in the Richmond Inquirer, I think in 1812. Let me just give you a flavor for it. And it came to pass in those days, there was no king in all the land, even all Columbia, but everyone walked after the imagination of his own heart. And the people said to one another, we will choose from among our own number elders to rule over us, even discreet men out of all the land of Columbia and from the borders of the Great Lakes, northward till thou comest to the plains of the south, where abounds with oranges, pomegranates, and figs. And let all the elders meet together in the great city, even the city of Philadelphia, and make laws for us. For why should our goodly heritage be given up to strangers? Okay, there we go. It's South Carolina, not Virginia. Shalov, he agrees that the Bible influenced the Book of Mormon text, but he also argues that in addition to, he argues two things. First, he argues that these particular texts that he's referring to influenced the readership of the Book of Mormon, that it may have prepared people in a way to read a book like the Book of Mormon that was written in biblical language. The second thing that he argues, though, however, is that it may have also influenced the text of the Book of Mormon, either Joseph Smith as either translator, or if, as some suppose, Joseph Smith was making up the Book of Mormon, that it influenced his language there. So, for example, he notes the tradition of writing in biblical style paved the way for the Book of Mormon by conditioning Americans to reading American texts and texts about America in biblical language. This pseudo-biblical tradition seemed to have numbed American sensibilities toward the mobilization of sacred language by acculturating Americans to text about America written in biblical language. The pseudo-biblical tradition helped pave the way for the Book of Mormon, or so he argues. Americans who'd been reading texts akin to in important aspects of Joseph Smith's Bible for many years before its publication were conditioned to comprehend texts written in the biblical style. You get the general idea. Now, Shalov also argues that this may, in addition to influencing readers, that it may have actually influenced the text of the Book of Mormon. By including American pseudo-biblicism in the intellectual inventory of the Second Great Awakening, Scripture and contemporary newspapers might possibly have been content enough to build a literary and imaginative or religious and divine framework for an American Bible. Now, recently, two critics of the Book of Mormon, a little over a year ago, have argued that one of these texts, in particular the Late War, we'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, Joseph Smith most likely grew up reading a school book called The Late War by Gilbert Hunt, and it heavily influenced his writing on the Book of Mormon. All right. Now, the idea that the first readers of the Book of Mormon may have been conditioned to accept its authenticity by political texts written in biblical style does not really present any particular challenge to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, in my view. Nor does the idea that Joseph Smith, the translator of the Book of Mormon, may have been influenced by biblical language present much controversy. These are, however, historical assertions and not proven facts. Before we examine these two interesting propositions, it's important to take note of some significant distinctions between the Book of Mormon and these so-called pseudo-biblical texts. First, it's worth noting that the texts in question are essentially all secular rather than religious in nature. As Shalov notes, surprisingly, this was not a predominantly religious idiom in these particular texts, as providence was notably absent from those texts as an active agent. And indeed, God is virtually absent from Snowden's history of the American Revolution, a curious fact, if only because many other contemporary American historians of the Revolution who were not committed to biblical style could assign providence a more significant role than Snowden did. So these writings that had biblical style tended to be secular, even though people weren't afraid to write about God's influence in the American Revolution and the histories that they wrote. And so, interestingly enough, these particular political texts were non-religious. So that's an important point. A second point that Shalov notes on this is that the Book of Mormon obviously is you can't say the Book of Mormon is secular. It's about as religious as you can get. Providence, unlike in these pseudo-biblical texts, which men were the main, not sole agents of historical agents, was omnipresent in the Book of Mormon. Like other contemporary visionary tracts, none of which made use of biblical language, the Book of Mormon proclaimed itself as a revelatory text intended to tell authentic religious truths, an attempt that even the most ambitious text written in pseudo-biblical style would not make. So these are two important distinctions: the secular nature of these sources that are supposed to influence readers of the Book of Mormon and perhaps the text of the Book of Mormon, and also the fact that the Book of Mormon is a religious text. An additional point that Shalev makes is the orientation of, or at least how they used, what parts of the Bible these particular texts tended to use, and it tended to be the Old Testament. This strong predilection for the Old rather than the New Testament is evident when one surveys pseudo-biblical texts, a sizable corpus written during more than a century. While each of those texts echoes and resonates with Old Testament narratives and protagonists, particularly the Book of Chronicles, Book of Judges, it is hard to find even a single reference to Christ, not to mention other New Testament characters or episodes. So an additional point to make is that not only did these texts tend to be secular and not talk about God or his influence on history, but they also were focused solely on using language from the Old Testament rather than the New. The Book of Mormon, although it also focuses on a lot in the Old Testament, is extremely Christocentric in the way that it talks about his people and their teachings and so forth. And there is New Testament language as much as Old Testament language. So these are two, I raise these mainly as questions posed to Shalev's thesis that these texts somehow were influential for readers of the Book of Mormon, or that they somehow may have influenced the text of the Book of Mormon. Shalev even admits assessing the assertion that pseudo-biblicism had actually participated in and contributed to the reception of the Book of Mormon is a daunting, not to say futile task. As reasonable as such a hypothesis may be, the evidence is mostly circumstantial. We have few, if any, direct references to pseudo-biblical language by contemporary consumers of those texts, and no direct ties connecting the Book of Mormon to pseudo-biblicism. Now, and in fact, as far as we can tell, the only place that we can find such evidence, or at least that I've been able to determine, for any connection with somebody who knew something about the Book of Mormon and these political texts that we're talking about, are in the writings of anti-Mormon writers, not Latter-day Saints. Give you an example. Abner Cole, who wrote under the pseudonym of Obadiah Dogberry, published a tabloid in Palmyra known as the Palmyra Reflector. There was a similar tabloid published in Rochester called Paul Pry's Weekly Bulletin. Here is a sample of this literary masterpiece. Now the rest, this one was published in 1829, about 8 months before the Book of Mormon is published. Now the rest of the deeds of Israel, how he yet liveth in shame, and of Joseph and Wanton, how they still cleave unto Israel, and of Horace the publican, how he couldn't get no beef on the 4th day of the week, and of Hiram the Jeremite, how he gave unto Israel a writing, promising to cleave unto him, how he too done the unclean thing against the body of a large oak near the precincts of the tabernacle. Don't ask. And of Chad the moneylender, how he squanders the monies of children of Samuel the miser. Behold, all these things, yea, many more, are graven on the massy leaves of the golden book, and are now in the custody of Joseph the prophet. Now, the person who wrote this hadn't seen the text of the Book of Mormon because it hadn't been published yet, but this perhaps gives some idea of what the kind of language they thought they might find in the Book of Mormon. Now, this is obviously a form of pseudo-biblicism that's adapted locally to events in Palmyra, individuals in Palmyra, which we can't fully identify. Maybe that's a good thing for history. But although it's a parody, it also reflects to some degree what critics expected to be published in the Book of Mormon. But such examples, apparently the only examples, again, come from critics, and they tend to be fairly literate critics who rejected the Book of Mormon rather than those who received it. I think it presents another possible challenge to Shallov's thesis. He argues that the prevalence of writings in the biblical style made the Book of Mormon more palatable to those who read it, but the evidence leads us to wonder if the reverse was true, and perhaps in terms of reception it may have been a factor for those who rejected the book. But it is unclear what, if any, impact the genre may have had on those who accepted it. And I'm going to turn it back to Paul here, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some of our findings.
Thank you. Here are some word clouds. There's 4 word clouds here. The size of the word represents the frequency of the use of that word inside a document. There's 4 documents represented. There is the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the American Revolution, and the Late War. Just take a look at those words. Can you identify which book would be associated with which cloud? Well, let me show you which ones are which. The Book of Mormon's in the upper right-hand corner, while the Bible's down in the lower right-hand corner. The Late War in the upper left-hand corner, and the American Revolution down below. Look how distinctively different the vocabulary is. Unto is the most prominent word in the Book of Mormon. The Lord is the most prominent word in the Bible. The Late War, men and king. In the American Revolution, men, people, and captain. I want you to take particular note to the size of the word land inside the Book of Mormon and its absence in the cloud in those other 3 documents. Now, examining what could be described as the King James version of the Bible style, the King James style of writing, we look at 4 dimensions. The first is non-contextual words. These are structural words. They carry no content meaning, but they're the words that provide the structure that an author uses to convey his or her message. These are words like the, and, but, so forth. The second is archaic words like thee and thou and ye, a second dimension in describing the King James style. A third is distinguishing phrases. In fact, the most predominant in describing that style is of the Lord. And last of all, the 4th dimension is the content topics, religion, war, and so on. Looking at that first dimension of non-contextual words, comparing the Book of Mormon to the King James style and each of those other texts to the King James style, we find that the similarity is much stronger between the Book of Mormon and the King James style than for the other 2 documents. In fact, it's about twice as similar as the Book of Mormon is about twice as similar as those other 2 documents in its use of non-contextual words, the structural words of how the message is put together. Looking at it further, comparing the Late War on the left-hand side, the column on the left-hand side, to the American Revolution, and the Book of Mormon compared to the American Revolution and the Late War, we can see that the use of non-contextual words is about the same for Book of Mormon and American Revolution and Late War, but the similarity between the Late War and the American Revolution is about 5 times stronger, much more internally structured in the use of language in those 2 documents. Archaic words, thee and thou, for example. The Book of Mormon and the King James Version are almost identical in the use of those words, while the American Revolution and Late War use those words much less, with much less frequency. Looking at distinguishing phrases and the similarity of use of those. Comparing on the left-hand side the Book of Mormon with the King James Version, about 7 times more similar in how they are used than in the other documents. The late war and the American Revolution only get it right about twice, while the Book of Mormon gets it right about 7 times more frequently. Again, comparing the American Revolution and the late war, and the similarity of the use of King James style frequency phrases, the late war and the American Revolution are over 12 times more similar to each other than the other documents. The Book of Mormon, compared to the late war and the American Revolution, much less on the right-hand side. The top 10 distinguishing phrases, by the way, of the Lord, unto, of Israel, shall be. These are the top 10 phrases that are distinctively useful in identifying the King James style. Looking at, with a color code, the similarity in the use of phrases, green indicates that the frequency of use between 2 documents is very much the same. So, for example, the Book of Mormon and the King James Version of the Bible on the right-hand side, upper right-hand corner, very close to being very similar in their use of the phrase of the Lord. But the distinctive phrase between the Book of Mormon and the Bible, lower right-hand corner, higher number, almost 8, you can see the phrase is the land. But if we're comparing American Revolution to the Bible, we see that the use of the land is very similar, and the same for the late war. But the distinction is the difference in the use of the phrase the Lord in the American Revolution and the late war. If we look at combinations of words that form a phrase, 4 words in length, 5, 6, 7, up to 9 words in length, and see how common those words are used between documents, we see that out of 10,000 word frequencies, the American Revolution and the late war use those common phrases far more frequently, the bars on the left-hand side of the graph, as compared to the Book of Mormon. The imitation of the King James Version by the American Revolution and the late war appears to be quite an exaggeration in the use of the vocabulary, words such as thee and thou, showeth, cometh, etc., and exaggerated imagery, referring to Britain, for example, as a fierce lion when he putteth his paw upon the innocent lamb, America, to devour him. There's also the use of the Latin form, the, some word, of, some word, 4-word sequence with the, something, of, something, as a possessive. For example, the hand of the king instead of saying the king's hand. Or embellishments, the engines of destruction instead of saying cannons. Or the year of the great founder of the Christian sect instead of saying AD. The American Revolution and the late war use these profusely. For example, on the left-hand side, all of these forms per 10,000 words, the American Revolution uses over 400 times. The late war, almost 400 times, while the King James Bible and the Book of Mormon are at least half or less than that amount. The Latin possessives alone is the most distinguishing for the late war, but in comparison again to the Book of Mormon, it's only about half as frequent. The Latin embellishments alone The American Revolution loves those 250 times per 10,000, while the Book of Mormon uses it only about 25 times, or 1/10 that amount. Looking at topics, the American Revolution is the blue bar, and the red bar is the late war. We can see that the frequency of the use of topics is very strongly military. On the topic of religion, not surprisingly, the Book of Mormon, the green bar, and Book of Mormon, the purple bar, are very high, wherein the American Revolution and the late war are almost zero. So we see a very distinctive difference in the frequency and the reference of these topics, using phrases which are distinctive to each of those texts. The most unique topical phrases in the American Revolution, over 1/3 of the phrases used in that text, as opposed to the Book of Mormon on the far right-hand side, which is only about 6 or 7% of the time, 1/20 of the amount. And so the distinctive use of phrases is repeated in the American Revolution and the late war, as opposed to in the Book of Mormon. There are a number of superficial similarities in the topics. Of course, when you're talking about war, political systems, and so on, and of course there's going to be similarities. It's also been pointed out that there is an order of events that is going on that seems to be similar. They talk about a battle at a fort. A rather superficial similarity, because if you're having a battle, how often is it at a fort? Or the taking of a key city? Or having heroes? Of course, if the narrative is on the topic of war, those are going to be references that are going to be identified very frequently. But they say that there's also this order of, first it's a battle at a fort, and then there's the taking of a city, and as a result we have heroes. But what we find most interesting in examining these texts is the contorted, torturous way that it comes about finding those similarities, because the order of events sometimes is separated by long periods of time, or they come in reverse order. So those similarities do not stand up to comparison. But whenever you have books that have the same topic or the same genre, there's always going to be similarities. And that has nothing to do with the source of the authorship or plagiarism, let alone influence, because similar words are always going to be there when you have similar topics. Take a look at this graph, if you would, for a moment. This shows over time. In the blue line, the divorce rate in the state of Maine. It also shows on the orange line the per capita consumption of margarine in the United States. The correlation between those two patterns is amazingly high at 99% out of a possible 100%. And so correlation and causation are much different than each other, and two things can follow almost exactly the same pattern and have no connection whatsoever. And even if you're looking at all books in the world, or even if you're only limiting yourself to 200,000 books in the world, this is what we call a big data search, one must be aware of the big data fallacy, because in any comparison there's always going to be something that is the closest to something else. And closest doesn't mean close. But if you have a large enough group, the closest one can appear to be, just in relative speaking terms, the close one. And this gives a false impression of two things being the same or of the same origin. And if that's what a researcher is looking for, there's an easy trap to fall into of saying, I have found it, when in fact there isn't anything there at all. And also the China fallacy, because think about this for a moment. If you consider yourself to be a 1 in a million guy on some characteristic, then there's 1,000 people in China who are just like you. just because the comparison group is so huge. And so if you search far enough and wide enough, you're always going to find something that is similar. So we conclude then on these four dimensions of the King James style: non-contextual words, archaic words, structure of the language, the unusual words that are used, distinguishing phrases, and the content topics. The Book of Mormon is more similar to the King James style than either the American Revolution or the late war. In fact, the American Revolution and the late war are similar to the King James style only in a contorted, pseudo-biblical, exaggerated caricaturation of the two. So if Joseph Smith was influenced by those books, his imitation of the King James style was better than theirs. Joseph Smith was either a literary genius or a prophet. We're all free to take our pick. Our overall conclusions then: using appropriate statistical techniques, the Book of Mormon's four main authors can easily be distinguishing between each other. The Book of Mormon is more substantially similar to the King James style in our four dimensions than either of those two proposed comparisons. We'd like to take a few minutes and thank our research contributors. Jason Lee, would you please stand up, and Larry Bassist, Emily Watts, Elena Hurst, and Gisette Cullen. If you'll join with me in thanking them. For their contributions, Matt and I will be happy to take your questions.
How is it known that Joseph Smith read the late war? Well, it's not. It's been assumed by recent critics who proposed it as a source, and they've pointed to certain nouns or words that are used and a few other things. One of the arguments that is used by those who want to suggest a connection is the late war. If you look at the title page, I don't have a blow-up of it here on the screen, but one of the things that the author of the late war was trying to do is he hoped to write this in the biblical style, be able to get this into the schools so that the children would get excited about reading history in the biblical style. In fact, the reverse seemed to be true. It really doesn't seem to have done that well. So the author expresses a desire to get this into the schools, and proponents of the theory that the late war influenced the Book of Mormon have taken that as a given fact, as an established fact, that in fact it got into all these schools, but there's no evidence of that. So that's a good question. Did you have one you want to take?
A recent study indicates that the language of the Book of Mormon is mostly 1600s English. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly what we have presented here today, that the style in the King James Version of the Bible and in the Book of Mormon are very, very similar to each other. Attempts at imitating that by other people have really not done a very good job of imitating it. Where can one find the latest research articles or books regarding Wordprint studies? By the way, the official name of the technical name for Wordprint studies is stylometrics, and this is primarily found in the literature of computational linguistics or the digital humanities. Chris Johnson, in his 2013 Ex-Mormon Foundation presentation, spent 80 minutes explaining how modern computer analysis of text is increasingly showing how the Book of Mormon is a product of contemporary text. What do you think of this trend, if any? There is no such trend. As we were just explaining, that's all based upon big data fallacies and the China syndrome fallacy. Book of Mormon uses the word "infind." I'm sorry, I can't read the rest of it. Whoever has this question, I'll be happy to talk to in person.
Try one. Are we? Oh, okay. One of the criticisms of the late war in the Book of Mormon raised by Ben McGuire in his interpreter essay is that Johnson's critics involved cherry-picked their comparative texts. How do you settle on the AR, I guess that's the American Revolution, as the only other comparator text? And do you need more to strengthen your conclusions? We got to start somewhere. The late war was one that they used. There are other texts that we could talk about, but these were among those that they had mentioned. Did you want to say anything on that as far as? Yeah, we'll be adding text to our research on that as far as that goes. I know there's one you might want to. You want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Happy to. How many authors does your research indicate in the Book of Mormon? It's easy to distinguish the primary authors and speakers within the Book of Mormon. It's easy to find 3. It's easy to find 4. And by the way, when we do this type of study, we're not identifying who they are ahead of time and then looking for them. We just look to find if there are consistencies that cluster together that can be identified as a speaker. And the thing that's most amazing, and we've found this now consistently since studies we've done back in the 1970s, is they cluster together, and they cluster together consistently. So it's easy to find 3 and 4. We can find 5 and 6 as well. What happens after that is the sample sizes start getting increasingly smaller, and so it's harder to distinguish them. But there's as many as 23 different speakers in the Book of Mormon. We have an ongoing stream of research on that topic. What stylometric methods have you used to distinguish between authors? We use multivariate statistics, principally discriminant analysis and principal components analysis. We also use methods that come from the genomic literature, nearest shrunken centroids, and our modification of that includes the open set possibility of someone else than a proposed author called extended nearest shrunken centroids.
Okay. Much.